The air in the officers' mess at Forward Operating Base Sentinel was a thick, layered thing, a geological strata of smells. At the bottom was the foundational scent of industrial-grade disinfectant, a sharp, sterile tang of ammonia that fought a losing war against the layers built upon it. Above that rested the heavy, greasy perfume of overcooked meatloaf and boiled potatoes, the day's uninspired offering to the gods of morale. This mingled with the faint, metallic scent of ozone from the humming banks of communication equipment along one wall, and the ever-present, ghostly aroma of diesel fuel that clung to every uniform, every surface, a constant reminder of the machinery of war that encircled them. The sound was a dull, continuous roar, the aggregate of 100 separate conversations, the clatter of steel cutlery on ceramic plates, and the scrape of chairs against a linoleum floor worn smooth by the passage of 1,000 boots. It was a place of temporary respite, a pressurized pocket of strained normalcy carved into the heart of a war zone. At a small, two-person table in the corner, far from the boisterous central cluster where the base command staff held court, a woman sat alone. She was an island of stillness in the turbulent sea of the mess hall. Had anyone bothered to truly look at her, they would have seen a study in deliberate anonymity. Her fatigues were standard issue, clean but unadorned, stripped of all rank, name, or unit patches. They were the clothes of a ghost, a transient, someone just passing through. Her hair, a nondescript brown, was pulled back into a severe, functional knot at the nape of her neck. Her face was lean, possessed of sharp angles that seemed more functional than beautiful, and her skin held the pale, indoor complexion of someone who spent more time in front of a screen than under the sun. She was perhaps in her mid-40s, but her movements had the economy and precision of someone much older, and her eyes, the only remarkable thing about her, were a pale, icy gray that seemed to absorb the light around them. They scanned the room not with curiosity, but with a kind of clinical assessment, cataloging the stress fractures in the institutional posture, the subtle tells of bravado and fear. She ate her meal with a slow, methodical rhythm, each movement of her fork precise, her focus absolute. In her other hand, she held a thick, data-bound technical manual, its cover simply stamped with a long string of alphanumeric code. She was not so much reading it as she was consuming it, her eyes tracking lines of dense text and complex schematics with an unwavering intensity. She was a quiet professional, an archetype of the hidden master, so perfectly camouflaged in her own unassuming plainness that she had become functionally invisible. To the casual observer, she was nobody of consequence. A civilian contractor, perhaps, a low-level intelligence analyst on temporary duty. Problem to be ignored. At the center of the room, a solar body around which all lesser satellites orbited, sat Colonel Marcus Thorne. He was the antithesis of the woman in the corner. Where she was quiet, he was a thunderclap of personality. Where she was anonymous, he was a monument to his own perceived importance. His uniform was also standard issue, but it had been tailored to fit his barrel chest and broad shoulders with a precision that bordered on vanity. His rank, the silver eagle of a full colonel, was polished to a near-blinding sheen. His face, weathered and ruddy, looked as if it had been carved from naval tradition itself, a block of granite shaped by years of bellowing orders into the wind. He was the base commander of FOB Sentinel, and he ruled his small fiefdom with an authority that radiated from him like heat from a furnace. He held a fork in one hand like a scepter, using it to punctave the air as he regaled his subordinate officers with a story of some past triumph. His voice was a booming baritone that effortlessly cut through the mess hall's din, demanding and receiving the attention of all those in his immediate vicinity. He was the arrogant antagonist, a man whose confidence was a suit of armor he wore to conceal a profound and gnawing insecurity. His self-worth was not an internal state but a thing to be constantly proven, measured by the deference of others, by the degree to which he could dominate his environment. He was a product of an older, simpler system, one that valued bluster over brilliance, style over substance. Thorne's gaze, sweeping his domain with proprietary satisfaction, finally landed on the woman in the corner. He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes narrowed. He saw not a person, but an anomaly, a disruption in the carefully orchestrated order of his world. He saw an empty uniform, a lack of appropriate insignia, a woman sitting alone in a section tacitly understood to be for field-grade officers and their guests. He saw a challenge. His subordinates, sensing the sudden shift in his mood, followed his gaze. A few of them smirked, anticipating the familiar spectacle of their commander dressing down some unfortunate soul who had transgressed one of his unwritten rules. To Thorn, her quiet self-containment was not a sign of discipline, but of insolence. Her focus on the manual was not evidence of diligence, but of disrespect. He saw a nail that was not hammered down, and he, the ever-ready hammer, felt the irresistible urge to strike. He pushed his chair back, the sound scraping loudly across the floor, a deliberate crack of thunder before the storm. He strode across the room, his polished boots clicking a sharp, authoritarian rhythm on the linoleum. The men at his table watched, a captive audience for the small drama about to unfold. The ambient noise of the mess hall seemed to dip slightly as others took notice of the colonel's purposeful march. He stopped directly in front of her table, casting a large shadow over her and her technical manual. He stood there for a long moment, waiting to be acknowledged, expecting her to startle, to look up with the requisite amount of fear and contrition. She did not. She continued to read, her eyes tracking the end of a line of text, before she calmly turned the page. The deliberate, unhurried motion was a profound insult, a declaration that he was not worthy of her immediate attention. It was the act of a lioness allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, utterly unconcerned by its yapping. Thorn's face flushed a deeper shade of crimson. His voice, when it came, was laced with a condescending drawl, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Lost, little lady? I think you've wandered into the wrong part of the playground." Slowly, deliberately, the woman lifted her eyes from the page. They were not frightened. They were not intimidated. They were flat, analytical, and utterly devoid of emotion. They met his gaze, and for a fleeting, disorienting second, Thorn felt like a specimen under a microscope. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear, with a precision that was almost unnerving. "I am where I need to be." The statement hung in the air, a simple, declarative fact that offered no purchase for an argument. It was not a plea, nor a defense. It was a verdict. The sheer, unadorned confidence of it momentarily stunned Thorn. He had expected a stammered apology, a flutter of confusion, a hasty retreat. He had received none of it. Her unnatural calm was a form of resistance more infuriating than any shouted retort. It denied him the reaction he craved, the emotional fuel his ego required. The smirks on his subordinates' faces began to waver, replaced by a flicker of confusion. This was not following the usual script. He leaned forward, placing his thick, manicured hands flat on her small table, attempting to use his physical size to dominate her. "That wasn't a suggestion, ma'am. This section is for command staff. I don't see any rank on you. I don't see a name. So I'll ask again. Who are you, and what gives you the right to sit here?" His voice was a low growl now, the velvet glove of condescension stripped away to reveal the iron fist of naked aggression. The woman did not lean back. She did not flinch. She held his gaze for another 3 heartbeats, a period of silence that stretched into an eternity. Her lack of a typical response was a vacuum, and Thorn's blustering rage rushed in to fill it. He was losing control of the encounter, and the public nature of it made him desperate. He needed to reassert his dominance. "You will answer me when I address you," he snarled, and in a fit of pique, he slammed his right hand down hard on the table. The flimsy metal surface jumped. Her glass of water tipped, spilling a clear, cold puddle across the table and onto the pages of her open manual. The act of minor physical violence seemed to satisfy him for a moment. He straightened up, a triumphant sneer on his face, expecting the destruction of her book to finally break her composure. He expected tears or anger or at the very least, a panicked attempt to save the pages. Instead, she simply looked down at the spreading pool of water. She watched as it soaked into the dense paper, darkening the complex schematics. Then, with an unnerving placidity, she reached for a napkin from the dispenser. She methodically, carefully, began to blot the water from the page, her movements as calm and measured as if she were cleaning a minor spill in her own kitchen. She did not look at him. She did not speak. She simply corrected the disruption he had created, treating his outburst of rage as nothing more than a clumsy accident, an inconvenience to be managed. Her calm was a mirror, and in it, Thorne's reflection was that of a petulant child. His fury, denied its expected outlet, redoubled. He was about to speak again, to escalate further, to grab her by the arm and physically eject her from his mess hall, when the world was torn apart by sound. The klaxons blared. It was not the rhythmic, almost polite tone of a drill. This was a raw, discordant shriek, the sound of pure, unadulterated emergency. Red lights flashed across the room, bathing everything and everyone in a hellish, pulsating glow. On the large monitors displaying base status, a single word blinked in stark, white letters against a blood-red background. Cascade. The term was one every officer in the room knew and dreaded. It was not a standard alert. It was the signal for a catastrophic, multi-vector, coordinated attack. A worst-case scenario, a nightmare made real. For a heartbeat, the mess hall was frozen in stunned silence. Then, it shattered into 1,000 pieces of panic. Chairs scraped violently as 100 officers leaped to their feet. Voices rose in a chaotic cacophony, shouting questions, bellowing orders that were immediately lost in the din. The disciplined structure of the officer corps dissolved into a mob of frightened men. Colonel Thorne, his petty conflict with the anonymous woman instantly forgotten, spun toward the comms console, his face a mask of shock. He was the commander. This was his moment. He grabbed the handset for the base-wide address system, his knuckles white. "This is Colonel Thorne. All units, report. What is the situation at the perimeter?" His voice, usually so commanding, now held a tremor of uncertainty. The response was a torrent of panicked, overlapping chatter from the tactical network. "Multiple impacts, Sector Gamma. Swarm detected. I repeat, drone swarm. High altitude. We have a breach at the south gate. They're inside the wire." Thorne's commands were textbook, reactive, and utterly inadequate. He shouted for counter-battery fire on Sector Gamma, not realizing the initial impacts were merely diversionary feints. He ordered the air defense teams to focus on the high-altitude drones, completely missing the low-level saturation attack that was the real threat. He was a man trying to read a chapter from a book he knew by heart, while the enemy was writing a new language of warfare on his doorstep. His authority, so absolute moments before, was revealed to be a hollow shell. He was performing command, not executing it, and his loud, ineffective response only added to the mounting chaos. He was a relic, facing a future he could not comprehend. In the midst of this pandemonium, the woman in the corner moved. Her previous stillness had been the coiled tension of a spring, and now it was released. She rose from her chair in a single, fluid motion that was shockingly graceful. She left the ruined manual on the table without a second glance. Her face was no longer placid or analytical. It was transformed. It was now a mask of absolute, chilling focus. The petty concerns of the mess hall, the spilled water, the blustering colonel, had been burned away by the fires of the crisis, leaving only the pure, hard steel of her purpose. She walked towards the central command console, her stride not hurried, but imbued with a terrifying economy of motion. Men, panicked and running in circles, seemed to part before her as if she were a ship's prow cutting through a churning sea. She reached the console just as Thorne was bellowing another useless order into the handset. She did not ask for the microphone. She did not say, "Excuse me." She simply reached out, her fingers moving with surgical precision, and keyed a different channel, overriding his command with a flick of a switch. She took the handset from his stunned, unresisting hand. She brought the microphone to her lips. She did not shout. Her voice, when it came, was broadcast across every speaker on the base, cutting through the panicked radio chatter with the clean, sharp authority of a scalpel. It was calm, it was measured, and it was the most commanding sound any of them had ever heard. All stations, this is Nemesis. Cease reactive fire. Discontinue all current counter-battery protocols. Authenticate. Crimson Echo 9. A single, stunned voice came back over the net. A young lieutenant in the Tactical Operations Center. Authentication valid. Mom. Nemesis? Is that you? Affirmative, she replied, her voice utterly flat. And then she began to issue orders. It was not a series of commands. It was a symphony of strategic orchestration. The language she spoke was a foreign tongue of expertise, a dense lexicon of advanced electronic warfare, integrated air defense systems, and predictive threat analysis that left every other officer in the room, including Thorn, completely lost. Grid Alpha, shift Phalanx Battery 3 to autonomous search and destroy, Vector 275, target profile Scythe-class microdrones, ignore the high-altitude decoys. They are data spoofing. The real threat is a saturation swarm at sub-50 meters. CyberOps, initiate glass shield protocol. I want a full-spectrum ghost signal broadcast on all enemy command frequencies. Make them think their breach team is reporting success. Feed them false telemetry. Buy me 90 seconds. Air Wing, scramble Raptor 1 and 2. Do not engage. I repeat, do not engage. I want a high-speed, low-altitude pass over Sector Delta. Full afterburners. The acoustic shockwave will disrupt the swarm's internodal communication. It's a network, not a mob. Break the network. Garrison, your South Gate breach is a feint. The primary infiltration point is the Northern Aqueduct, Section 9. I am marking it on your tactical displays now. They are not a heavy assault team. They are combat engineers. Their target is the primary power conduit. Seal that tunnel. Now! The mess hall was silent. The chaos had ceased, replaced by a profound, collective awe. The men who had been shouting and running were now frozen, listening to the voice on the speakers as it single-handedly, methodically, dismantled a complex, multi-pronged attack with a series of brilliant, counterintuitive, and perfectly executed commands. Colonel Thorne stood beside her, the handset still warm in his hand from where she had taken it. His mouth was slightly agape, his face pale with a dawning, horrified comprehension. He was watching a master at work. He was not even a student in her classroom. He was the chalk dust on the floor. She was not just competent. She was a prodigy, a force of nature. In the space of 2 minutes, she had analyzed the threat, predicted the enemy's strategy, identified their true objectives, and formulated a flawless, multi-layered defense. The panic chatter on the comms was replaced by the crisp, disciplined acknowledgments of her orders. Wilco, executing, target destroyed, the tide of the battle, a battle that had been on the verge of becoming a massacre, was turning. The storm was being tamed. Just as the last of the immediate threats was neutralized and an eerie calm began to settle, the main doors to the mess hall burst open. A man strode in who commanded respect without saying a word. He was Command Sergeant Major Davies, a living legend within the enlisted ranks, a man who had more time in combat than most of the officers in the room had time in the service. His face was a roadmap of a hard life, and his eyes, sharp and intelligent, swept the room with an urgent intensity. He was the ultimate recognizer, a man whose wisdom had been forged in the crucible of a dozen conflicts, a man who could see past the superficialities of rank and uniform to the core of a soldier. Where is he? Davies's voice was a low rumble, like grinding stones. Who the hell is Nemesis? The TOC is lit up like a Christmas tree, and that voice just saved this entire base from being a smoking crater. His eyes scanned the room, passing over the stunned colonels and majors. He saw Colonel Thorne, standing dumbly by the console, and dismissed him with a glance. Then his eyes found the woman, the unassuming, anonymous woman in the plain fatigues. Davies stopped. His entire body went rigid. The gruff, urgent expression on his face vanished, replaced by one of absolute, profound, and unequivocal reverence. It was the look of a devout man seeing a vision. In the dead silence of the room, Command Sergeant Major Davies drew himself up to his full height. He slammed the heel of his boot onto the linoleum floor, the sound like a rifle shot. He executed the sharpest, most perfect salute of his long and storied career. His voice, which had been a rumble, now became a thunderclap that shook the very air. Attention on deck! The command was instinctual, reflexive, for every soldier in the room. 100 chairs scraped back as 100 officers, including a bewildered and terrified Colonel Thorne, snapped to the position of attention. They stood ramrod straight, their eyes locked forward, their minds reeling in confusion. They were at attention, but they didn't know for whom. Davies did not break his salute. His eyes remained locked on the woman. He spoke again, his voice filled with a deference that bordered on worship, each word precise and weighted with meaning.
General Rostova, Mom.
My apologies for the intrusion. We have confirmation from Stratcom. The attack profile matches Cerberus-level incursion protocols. Your orders. The name descended upon the room like a physical weight, a bomb of comprehension that shattered every assumption, every prejudice. General, not a contractor, not a lieutenant, a general, and not just any general. The name Rostova, the call sign Nemesis. It clicked into place in their minds, coalescing from rumor, legend, and classified briefing documents. General Eva Nemesis Rostova, the architect of the Ghost Doctrine, the youngest officer ever to be promoted to brigadier general in the history of the command. The phantom strategist who had dismantled entire enemy networks without ever setting foot on a battlefield. A figure so legendary, so shrouded in secrecy, that most of them had assumed she was a myth, a boogeyman invented to scare junior officers. The narrator could now list her achievements like a litany of impossibilities. The victor of the silent cyber war of 28, the mind behind the flawless extraction at Al-Qadir, recipient of a classified medal so prestigious it was said only 3 had ever been awarded. She was not just a general. She was a living weapon, the sharpest mind in a generation, and she was standing here in their mess hall, wearing the anonymous fatigues of a common soldier. The blood drained from Colonel Thorne's face. The full, catastrophic scale of his miscalculation crashed down upon him. He had not just insulted a superior officer. He had berated, mocked, and physically assaulted a living legend. He had danced like a foolish jackal at the feet of the apex predator, and he had been too arrogant, too blind, to even recognize the danger. The memory of his own words, "Lost, little lady?" echoed in his mind, each syllable a new spike of shame and terror. His career was over. He knew it. He was a dead man walking. General Rostova turned her head slowly, her icy gray eyes finally settling on the pale, trembling Colonel Thorne. The silence in the room was absolute, a perfect vacuum of anticipation. Every person held their breath, waiting for the inevitable, brutal verdict. They expected shouting, a public stripping of rank, a career executed in front of them all. But Rostova's voice, when it came, was still quiet. It was not angry. It was clinical, the tone of a surgeon dissecting a tumor. "Colonel Thorne," she began, the 2 words a precise, devastating incision. "Your performance today was not merely inadequate. It was a tactical liability. Your response time to the initial alert was 37 seconds slower than the doctrinal maximum. Your counter-battery orders for Sector Gamma would have wasted valuable munitions on ghost positions, a classic diversionary tactic you failed to identify. Your fixation on the high-altitude decoys demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of modern drone warfare. You treated a complex, asymmetrical threat as a simple, by-the-book problem." She took a step closer to him. He flinched, but she stopped just outside of his personal space. "Your behavior before the alert," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, becoming a precise, deadly whisper that only he could hear, yet everyone felt, was even more revealing. "You mistook a lack of ornamentation for a lack of substance. You saw a woman and you assumed incompetence. You saw quietness and you assumed weakness. Your prejudice, Colonel, is not a personal failing I care about. It is a critical flaw in your analytical process. You failed to gather data. You failed to observe. You failed to assess an unknown variable. You saw what you wanted to see, and you acted on flawed, incomplete intelligence. That is a mistake that can lose battles, break armies, and burn nations. Thorn could not speak. He could only stand there, swaying slightly, drowning in the cold, clear truth of her words. He waited for the final blow. "You are relieved of command," the words he knew were coming. But she did not say them. Instead, a flicker of something that was not quite a smile touched the corners of her lips. It was a look of profound, intellectual curiosity, the expression of a master craftsman contemplating a flawed but potentially salvageable piece of material. "Therefore," she said, her voice rising to a normal volume again for all to hear, "I will not have you relieved. A court-martial would be a waste of administrative resources, and sending you to a staff position at some forgotten desk would teach you nothing. Your education has clearly been deficient, Colonel, and I have found that the most effective pedagogy is direct, sustained exposure." She paused, letting the implication of her words sink in. "Effective at 0600 tomorrow, you are reassigned. You will be my new executive aide. You will carry my briefing case. You will fetch my coffee. You will stand silently in the corner of every meeting I attend. You will take notes on every decision I make, and you will submit a nightly report analyzing my strategic process. You will be my shadow, Colonel Thorn, and you will learn, through forced, relentless proximity, the profound and critical difference between the hollow performance of authority and the silent, deadly execution of command. Your re-education begins now." Dismissed. The story of that day passed into the institutional lore of the armed forces. It became a modern military fable, a teaching tool used at command schools and war colleges. It was known by many names: Thorn's Folly, the Lunch at Sentinel, or, most commonly, the day Nemesis came to lunch. With each telling, the details grew more embellished. The storm outside the base grew more violent. The number of enemy drones multiplied. Colonel Thorn's insults became more cartoonishly villainous. But the core truth of the story, the essential lesson, remained pure and unchanged. It became a foundational cautionary tale, a stark reminder that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you notice last. Years passed. The world turned, and the nature of conflict continued to evolve. In a sterile, state-of-the-art lecture hall at the National War College, a group of newly promoted, cocky young colonels sat listening to a guest speaker. The man at the podium was Brigadier General Marcus Thorn. He was an older man now, his hair grayed at the temples. The boisterous arrogance of his youth was gone, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful gravitas. He was known as one of the most brilliant and insightful instructors at the college, a man with an almost preternatural ability to teach the complexities of modern command. He stood before the class, his hands resting lightly on the lectern. "Today," he began, his voice calm and even, "we are not going to talk about tactics or strategy. We are not going to talk about logistics or theory. We are going to talk about the single greatest tactical liability a commander can possess: assumption. And to illustrate this point, I am going to tell you a story about the most profound and humiliating day of my life." And he told them the story. He spared himself no embarrassment, recounting his own arrogance, his own blindness, his own foolishness in excruciating detail. He spoke of the quiet woman in the corner, of the spilled water, of the klaxons, and of the voice that had cut through the chaos and saved them all. He used his own humiliation not as a source of shame, but as a teaching instrument of immense power. He had been transformed. The fire of his public humbling had burned away the dross of his ego, leaving behind the hard, pure steel of wisdom. He had become a disciple of the woman who had dismantled his world, and he now dedicated his life to spreading her philosophy. He was teaching the very lesson he had learned at such a great cost. "Never," he concluded, his eyes sweeping across the faces of the next generation of leaders, "never assume you are the most dangerous person in the room. True strength does not need to advertise. True authority is not worn on a collar. It is wielded in the mind. Let your actions be your rank. Let your competence be your voice. The moment you believe your position makes you superior is the moment you have become a liability to everyone you are sworn to protect. Class dismissed. The story, in the end, is about a simple, universal truth that extends far beyond the confines of a military base. It is a lesson for every boardroom, every classroom, every factory floor, every quiet corner where substance is overlooked in favor of style. It is the eternally relevant moral that true strength is quiet competence. It is the understanding that authority is earned through action, not declared by title. It is the quiet professional against the loud amateur, the hidden master against the boastful fool. It is a reminder to look past the uniform, to see beyond the surface, to judge not by the volume of the voice but by the weight of the deeds. For hubris is a self-inflicted wound, and the greatest power often lies in the stillness before the storm, in the one person you never, ever saw coming.